This is an informal launch for the Voices of Kingsford Smith.
It's a fantastic piece of long-form journalism. That's what we're here to talk about while launching this community organisation. So Marian and I worked together at the Sydney Morning Herald for quite a long time, but we actually didn't work together very much. We were in separate parts of the Sydney Morning Herald, but it's very nice to be sitting here next to Marian. I've got the deepest respect for her work. She is a multi-award winning journalist. She was fantastic back in the day and has just continued to be as she's worked through radio, television, print, online. She's covered politics, national security, refugee issues, climate change, of course, which is what we're here for. She's served as foreign correspondent in Washington, DC for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. She was deputy editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, executive producer of the ABC's Four Corners program, and I'm sorry, I'm really embarrassing you here, I'm sure, but I'm going to keep going.
No.
Yeah, executive producer of Four Corners at the ABC, senior reporter with Four Corners. She reported for Australian Foreign Affairs magazine, The Monthly, The Saturday paper, The Australian, the ABC 7:30. That's a lot. In 2018, she was inducted into the Australian Media Hall of Fame, which I think is a fair recognition of her contribution. Marian's books include The Carbon Club on the politics of Australia's fraught climate change policy, The Fixer, which is a biography of Labor power broker Graham Richardson, and Dark Victory with the inimitable David Marr about asylum seekers and some dirty politics. It's great that Marian's here. I'm happy to be sitting next to her here, and I hope we all appreciate her being here. Should we start?
Yeah.
Let's start. Okay, so it's hot in here, right? What a day. What a day with this, crazy heat wave with heat that's come from where? From the Pilbara. Could there be anything more eerie and appropriate at the same time? That's what we're here to discuss, right? Climate, heat, too much heat, and the connection with Woodside. The title says it all, Woodside versus the planet. I mean, today we had these crazy temperatures. I just checked earlier. It was 38.8 at Sydney Airport, 39.5 at Penrith. There's been predictions that this month's average maximum temperature will come in at over 27 degrees, which is 5 degrees hotter than normal, which will beat not only the record for the warmest October, but for the warmest November since records were first kept. So that's terrifying. Look, that is very much at issue in your essay, right? So mining and climate change. Woodside versus the planet, how a company captured a country. It reveals how Woodside are mining natural gas, and they want to keep doing this and in fact do more of it, which has major impacts on the climate. Before we get into some of the detail, what attracted you to this story?
Thanks, Sacha, and thanks for all coming out tonight to hear about a very dense topic. But look, what actually interested me about this was two things. One was the present. I was looking at this campaign against Woodside in the West really ramping up. I've always been interested in Woodside, but there were two things that really grabbed my attention. And I think it's really relevant probably for this audience. Number one was the enormous gulf that existed between the climate movement and their understanding and passion about what was happening up on the Burrup Hub with the expansion of Woodside's gas developments and their climate implications. And what I was hearing from people I knew in the business world, from business journalists and from reading the business pages about the enormous enthusiasm for what was happening on the Burrup in terms of the future continued development of the Australian gas industry. And it struck me as fascinating because literally almost 10 years earlier in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, I had seen the gas industry mobilise themselves as essentially the saviours of the planet, that they were going to be the great transition fuel. Using gas, we could transition away from coal and then somehow eventually get to renewables. And now, a decade on, this story was again being repeated. I wanted to look at this. I wanted to look at why Australia is still very enthusiastically behind its gas export business, but also, while they ran this argument intellectually, is also still very heavily behind the coal export business, which is rather contradictory. The second thing that I really wanted to dive into is this idea that Australia doesn't have any responsibilities for the emissions caused by what we export overseas. It's an argument that I have listened to and gone round in circles in ever since I started looking at this area, basically back in about 2005. And I had largely myself always accepted the position that was given to me in interviews by UN officials, by government officials, by a lot of people even in the renewable energy industry, that Scope 3 emissions, as they're known as, and I'm sure most of you know what they are, but they're the emissions that are produced by our customers when they burn the gas or coal overseas, must be the responsibility of the customer. And essentially, if we didn't stick to this, we were upending the UN framework on climate change, and we were double accounting. The problem was, as this has gone on, more and more climate scientists have raised the issue about this conundrum, in essence, that if we keep doing this and fossil fuel exports keep rising and greenhouse gas emissions keep rising, we're going to keep going round in circles. On the other side, you have the climate movement taking the view that if you are a citizen of a country that has a big fossil fuel export industry and you profit from that industry, then you bear some responsibility. And that was the argument that really excited me about the Woodside issue, because essentially almost the entire mainstream climate movement in Australia decided to take on that elephant in the room and to challenge it, and to use Woodside to challenge it. And then just as I was finishing the essay, the incredibly interesting advisory opinion came down from the International Court of Justice, which said a unanimous opinion from all the 15 judges on that bench, saying that countries cannot basically hide behind the UN framework and the Paris Agreement to fulfil their responsibilities on their greenhouse gas emissions. This was a decision, an opinion I should say, that came down because a number of our small Pacific neighbours, Vanuatu specifically, led a charge for this case, but were backed by small island states around the world. And they went to the International Court of Justice to test fundamentally that issue. One of the key issues they wanted to test. And Australia, along with Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, the UK and the US, presented their submission, which was to say, no, the UN framework covers this. In that advisory opinion that came out in July, all the judges said no. That above and beyond the Paris Agreement and the UN framework on climate change, all countries have a broader responsibility under international law for all the emissions that they participate in generating, and countries that don't take regard of this and continue to license fossil fuel companies and subsidise them may leave themselves open to reparations from other countries. And so for me, this has kind of dovetailed into the Woodside story in a really important way.
Thank you. And a fascinating decision internationally that came hot on the heels of an Australian decision by the Federal Court, of course, knocking back some plaintiffs who were seeking to hold the federal government accountable. So some interesting developments happening in the law space. That's a fantastic answer and such great background. Big question, but what did you learn? What were some of the things that you learnt doing the essay, which is, you know, a remarkable piece of long-form journalism with so much research underpinning it?
There was a couple of things I was particularly interested in looking at in the Woodside story. Years ago, when I began covering this area, I came across Woodside for the first time, in that they were, the then CEO, an American guy called Don Volti, was going head to head with Penny Wong, who was then the climate change minister, over Kevin Rudd's first attempt to get up climate change legislation and emissions reduction targets. And he was a very, very aggressive guy. He'd come out of the US oil company Mobil, and he had some big stand-up fights with Penny Wong at the time, which she was, if anyone who knows Penny Wong, she's a pretty tough character herself, and she definitely stood her ground there. But what interested me was that I'd done a lot of work on coal companies, but Woodside was really different. And it was really different for a couple of reasons. Their board was a really political board. When I first began looking at them, their chairman was a guy called Charles Goode. Funnily enough, he wasn't from Perth, but he was very big in Collins Street in Melbourne. And he happened to also sit on a board with a guy called Hugh Morgan, that some of you might have heard of, one of probably the most important climate skeptics in Australia, very big in the mining industry, hugely funded skeptic movements in Australia. Well, Charles Goode was his pal. They sat on something together called the Cormack Foundation, which was one of the big funding bodies for the Liberal Party. When I began looking at the Woodside board, there'd be this really fascinating turnover in political connections. So that, for example, a few of you might remember a while ago there was a spying operation in Timor, a rather infamous spying operation where Australia spied on the Timorese government over the drawing of the boundaries, sea boundaries between Australia and East Timor. And at the bottom of all that was leases, gas leases, and one of the most important players in all that was Woodside. So after that whole operation went down, the head of Foreign Affairs, which at that stage was also heavily involved with ASIS, left the head of Foreign Affairs and went and sat on the Woodside board. The person who was Foreign Minister at the time, Alexander Downer, then joined a lobbying company that was lobbying for Woodside. And when I went to interview Downer for Four Corners, when I was actually investigating the Timor case, I said to him, you know, well, how many conversations did you have with Charles Goode when you were doing, when you were involved in all these negotiations with the Timorese government? And he said, I never spoke to Charles Goode. I just dealt with Don Volti, So it was like, and I said, but what I'm trying to understand is, what is the separation between Woodside's interests and the government's interests when it comes to East Timor? And he couldn't understand the question. It just, obviously, this is in Australia's interests. And when I went to Western Australia, and I deliberately went and spoke to a whole lot of people who were supporters of the industry. I spent a long time with Colin Barnett, the former Liberal Party Premier, very pro-gas. I after a lot of hassling, got to talk to Meg O'Neill. I spoke to ex-Woodside executives, and I spoke to ex-government officials. And this sense that what is good for Woodside is good for Australia, but particularly what is good for Woodside is good for Western Australia, was something that was deep in the psyche, and certainly deep in the psyche of Western Australia. And to be fair, you have to understand why. And part of the reason was when the North West Shelf gas development first happened, it was a huge deal in WA. It was like our sort of snowy hydro project here. And it was hugely beneficial in WA, albeit with vast amounts of government money put in to support it. But it did help power Western Australia, power Perth, and develop really big minerals processing industries there, and a lot of blue collar jobs. So I know people say the gas industry itself doesn't have many jobs, but they do support a lot of industrial jobs. So you can understand it. The thing that really struck me though, and I know this sounds arrogant for an outsider, was I did feel, because I grew up in Queensland, so it really reminded me of Queensland, and I really felt that the thinking was just increasingly out of date, that there is a feeling there that this can and will go on forever, as we saw with the extension to 2070. And the more research I did, the more I think that that is really going to be challenged.
Yeah, wow, really interesting. Look, that issue that you raised there of the alignment of interest between the government and Woodside, or companies more generally, is fascinating. So let's dwell on that for a minute. So you describe in great detail the role of energy companies and news media in, well, what's the right phrase here? Collaborating effectively with the Labor government of Western Australia. You also describe the federal government and its role and how supportive it has been of Woodside. Again, I guess to be euphemistic. Can you explain that a little bit more? And were you surprised, I guess, by the federal government, who is ostensibly and explicitly committed to the environment, and yet, you know, is very supportive of this mining company, Woodside, in WA?
There's a section in the essay where I look at the future gas strategy, which I know sounds a bit boring, but a few of you might remember it came out last year. And when it came out, it really did knock a lot of people in the climate movement, and I know in the Teals, and I know in the crossbench, the other independents. And it also knocked a lot of people in the renewable energy industry. But for me, it made a lot of sense if you understand what's going on in WA. There is a deep commitment to the gas industry by all the major parties, but also all the governments. And partly it's about the strong idea about the role that gas is going to play in the energy transition, and that is a real role. And I think no one who actually looks at the energy industry would deny that it's got a role and an important role to play. But there is also, I think the more I delved into it, the more interesting I found the fact that our trade and foreign policy is deeply, deeply tied up with the Woodside story. Woodside basically opened up the LNG industry in WA. A lot of the other companies brought more development, Chevron obviously, but the Japanese company Impex, Shell, and all the others. So Australia, the federal Australian government's foreign policy and trade policy is hugely dependent on this. And most people don't realise that about a third of Australia's exports, including goods and services, like we say we export, you know, education and all these other intangibles, but a third of our exports of all goods and services are fossil fuels. That is what we do. And so in writing the essay, what I was trying to do was to say, if you look at the future gas strategy, if you look at what Australia is doing as an exporter, we need to have a national conversation about this, because I also read the climate science, I interview climate scientists, and there's just a major collision course that's going on here, as it is in America, as it is elsewhere, but Australia is on that collision course. And even the government's own analysis, if you look at the Climate Change Authority's Pathways reports, they all say if the world is going to stick to the Paris Agreement and achieve temperatures at least below 2 degrees, then LNG prices just have to plummet. LNG exports have to plummet. Coal exports have to plummet. And yet at the moment, we just are proceeding as if none of this is going to happen.
You describe early on in the essay a Woodside AGM, I think it is, where a bunch of activists, one after another, blow whistles to disrupt the AGM. We might be seeing a variation of that, where some external players have infiltrated mobile phones to go off one after another in the room to disrupt this speech. But we're just going to press on. Look, you've covered this a little bit, but I think it's worth addressing directly. Woodside make an argument that they need to expand liquid natural gas mining to save the planet, basically, you know, to be good for the environment, to help the transition to renewables. Can you explain their argument, and also give your response and whether you buy it?
When I spoke to Meg O'Neill, this was she's the CEO of Woodside, this was the argument that she really wanted to keep pressing and pressing. And not long after, actually not long before I spoke to her, I think there was also the energy producers, Australian energy producers, the major gas lobby group, got a consultancy to put out a report saying exactly the same thing. And when I went to interview the former WA gas and energy minister, he kind of sat me down and lectured me for about an hour, delivering exactly that same message that Meg O'Neill delivered, that without LNG exports, Asia can't decarbonise. How do we know this? Well, they've told us this. And this becomes a circular argument. The problem is there has never been a proper, broad piece of government work done on whether this is right or not. And the question that's raised not only here, but in Japan, in South Korea, and elsewhere is, are these LNG exports actually helping decarbonise, or are they slowing the decarbonisation? Basically, are they squeezing out renewable energy? Because if you look at Japan, it's a very, as we know, very advanced Western country, an incredible manufacturing base. Their uptake of renewable energy is really weak, and has been for a while. And you only have to look at their, basically their car industry, which is, you know, one of their key industries. They have fought tooth and nail to slow down the development of the electric vehicle industry around the world. When Chris Bowen was putting up the new regulations on emissions here to open a pathway for electric vehicle sales, Toyota's lobbyists were going hell for leather on a campaign to weaken those standards. And in fact, you know, they did have some success on that. They're basically in a really, really difficult position. The German car makers, by and large, the Japanese car makers, by and large, are seeing this, their industries under threat from what's happening in China. You only have to look at what's happening in China, the rapid advances in battery technology as well as renewable technology, to know that the gas industry is in competition with renewable energy. And I think this is where we do need a debate in this country. If you want to debate the issue of should there be a climate trigger in the environment laws, should approvals for mega fossil fuel projects include a climate trigger, you have to ask that question. Is it enough for companies to say that the customers will take care of the emissions? Is the gas industry in particular squeezing out renewable energy? There's been efforts by CSIRO to do a few studies on this. There was an effort by the US Department of Energy last year to do exactly this study. None of them have been great. There's a lot of qualifications in the modelling, but there are serious questions in the reports done so far that you can show that a certain level of gas exports will squeeze out the renewable energy transition rather than support it.
Thank you. Apart from the issue of the environment, there's also the issue of harm to Indigenous heritage, right, which is really relevant here and is part of your essay too. I've never been to this part of the world. I've been to WA, it's an amazing state. This part of WA sounds amazing and you describe it in the essay, so please tell us a bit about that. But the rock art sounds remarkable, and I had no idea that, you know, some of it is as old as it is, 50,000 years or so, and the extent of it in this particular part of the world, in Murujuga. Just in July, you know, just as the essay was coming to, you would have been finishing your work on it, it was awarded World Heritage Listing status by UNESCO after a tricky process, and I don't think that in itself got enough publicity. But can you tell us a bit about how, there's a lot wrapped up in this question, right? But I guess to keep it as simple as possible, but how does all that talk that we've just been having about the climate relate to these issues of Indigenous art preservation?
Yeah, it's a big story, and I can't tell it all, and even in the essay, my editor kept hounding me to cut back the section on the rock art, because he said you're steering off your main debate about climate. But I maintain there is a really important relevance here, and this was brought home to me. Some of you who've read the essay will know this, but when I was up in on the Burrup, a couple of people, including Carmen Lawrence, said, I'll introduce you to one guy you should really go and see. He lives up on Dampier Port. And so when I went up to the Burrup, I went to see him, and his name is Ken Mulvaney. And for years he was the Indigenous Heritage Officer with Rio Tinto, and his job was working on the Burrup Peninsula as an industry liaison with the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation. But Ken has a really interesting history, because many decades before, in the 1980s, he was a young museum worker specialising in rock art at the WA Museum, and he was asked to go up to the Burrup Peninsula for what was supposed to be a heritage salvage operation, because there was, on the construction site, on the massive construction site of the first Northwest Shelf Karratha gas plant, thousands of pieces of ancient rock art. Woodside and its partners knew they had a problem, so they did a big PR exercise where they said, we're going to have the biggest salvage operation, heritage salvage operation in Australia's history, and we're going to preserve this rock art. what actually happened, according to Ken, when he was up there, was that they were often working in front of the bulldozers to try and save what they could, as a lot of pieces of the rock art were literally crushed and later crushed and buried in the foundations of that gas plant. One of the big problems they had was that the government then of Sir Charles Court, the Liberal government, had given an edict to all the white heritage workers from the museum that they were not allowed to officially communicate with any Indigenous person involved in the borough. That meant, obviously, some of them did forge relationships with the local people up there, some of the elders. But as Ken put it, the problem for all these white heritage specialists was they knew this stuff was really important, but they had no idea how it fitted together with the landscape. So that whole connection between landscape and heritage was essentially lost. And, you know, I mean, what really made a difference was a lot of people then started doing work on it and putting the pieces literally together. That left, though, a really bitter legacy on the borough. And the companies realised that they had to have a relationship with the Indigenous people that was more inclusive, and so did the government, but only for purposes of expanding gas development on the borough. And that's what happened. But essentially the main Indigenous corporation, as part of that, is largely funded by the companies. And so all their heritage work, particularly for the World Heritage listing, was funded by the companies. And they have learned that if you're on the wrong side of Woodside, things go really wrong, and and given that Woodside has won every battle up there, that you really have to work out which side you're on. And that's essentially what happened. There was a splinter group called Save Our Songlines, and at the heart of that issue was not the greenhouse gas emissions that we all know about, it's the industrial emissions that churn out from that plant. And essentially, of course, keeping the plant going till 2070, building the new Scarborough plant, feeding the Scarborough plant gas to a new fertiliser plant also being built on the borough, that's all producing more industrial emissions. Anyway, the end of the day, Ken Mulvaney, as I understood it, did some work to help some of the Indigenous people who were opposing those developments. And very soon after, he had to resign from Rio Tinto. And even though he's an expert in the Murujuga rock art, he can now no longer work on it. So he's just one more person who was on the wrong side, you know, when the cards finally played out. But the industrial emissions is still a big issue. There's a current rock art monitoring program going on there to try and monitor those emissions. The Cook government essentially said there's nothing wrong, nothing to see here, all these emissions came in the past. Even Murray Watt, in his recent conditions that he put on Woodside, had to acknowledge from his departmental work that there are still emissions most likely causing damage, and they're most likely from Woodside. And the reason they're from Woodside is that the Karratha gas plant is the largest industrial emitter. That's of things like NOx and SOx on the borough today.
Were you very moved by the rock art when you went there?
I had an amazing experience. Quite a number of the people who knew the rock art well told me to go to this place called Deep Gorge and to only go at sunset, because that's when the light is best, because the rock art can be hard to see if the lights, you know, if the sun's right above you. And so I went, and it is one of those things when you walk along, you know, you see things like a xylophone, you know, Tasmanian tiger. And as Ken said to me, you know, you've got to remember that that animal disappeared from the burrup in 2,000 years ago. So when that was carved, that was probably millennial ago. And obviously long before they were made extinct in Tasmania. But, you know, spirits and, you know, giant kangaroos, amazing images of animals that no longer exist today. But literally, if you walk to the end of the path where this main gallery is, as I did at the time, you turn around and you see the gas flare from the Pluto gas plant. You see the giant Yarra fertiliser plant and explosives plant. And literally the bulldozers were going full bore a kilometre away to build the new fertiliser plant, because they're the anchor domestic client for Woodside, buying Woodside's domestic gas. And as I say in the essay, you know, you do have a sense, if you stand there in 2025, of thinking, what on earth are we doing? We've just got World Heritage listing on this site, and a kilometre away, all this is going on. And we've decided that it's a really good idea to build a new fertiliser plant that is run on gas, producing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions as well as industrial emissions. And everyone thinks it's a great idea, and there's a lot of state government money poured into it to subsidise it, to make it all happen.
Mm. Look, I'll just ask a couple more before I'll throw it open to the audience. What you've just described is very interesting, and I guess intuitively we would expect a deep connection perhaps between the Indigenous groups and the climate activists, but of course it's much more complicated, right, as you've just been talking about. Look, to turn back to the climate, there was an interesting piece released this month from Australian academics that you probably saw. They released some new research which was summarised in The Conversation, and they wrote, I'm quoting here, global warming from Woodside's massive Scarborough gas project off WA would lead to 484 additional heat-related deaths in Europe alone this century, and kill about 16 million additional corals on the Great Barrier Reef during each future mass bleaching event. So that's what the new research revealed. Very timely in terms of your essay as well, but what's next for Woodside and this issue?
This issue of, it's called the issue of attribution, and it's going to be a big thing in all the legal cases that may flow following the ICJ opinion. But can I tell you, it's bloody complicated. And I did discuss this with Meg O'Neill, and one of the, because it had come up previously, and this is where it gets really complicated when you're trying to say, okay, Woodside's responsible for an extra X 100,000 corals dying because they produce 6 billion tonnes of emissions. The first thing that comes back is, hang on, we're selling to Japan. Japan has its own target. It will bring down its emissions. It will deal with this. And we're also, operate under the safeguard mechanism at home where we reduce our emissions. So while technically it will be that amount of emissions, our customers will deal with them, we'll deal with them, and we all want to get to net zero. This is why you really need to open up the issue about scope 3 emissions and who is dealing with them. And I guess this is the current debate, and one thing that I think is a really important political discussion that is going on right now in Canberra It's whether there should be a climate trigger in the EPBC Act. Everyone in business and in government and in the coalition says no. They say Scope 3 is up to our customers, Scope 1 we're dealing with under the safeguard mechanism. Funnily enough, when these laws were reviewed by Graham Samuel, a few of you might know about the Samuel review, he did, while he accepted that, he also did raise the issue that on these big projects, there should be some sort of avenue to account for your Scope 3 emissions and also explain the plan to deal with them. I think for a lot of climate lawyers, that's left a door open to say it actually, climate considerations should be in the EPBC Act. I spoke at a couple of forums with Kate Cheney in Perth, with David Pocock in Canberra, where this came up. All were incredibly pessimistic that this will get in. Murray Watt, as you probably know, has been ruling this out. Roger Cook has certainly been ruling it out. But there's a very flexible political dynamic going on at the moment, as you all probably know. The coalition is split over net zero. The Liberal Party is split over net zero. And there's a lot of undermining of Susan Lee, the new leader, going on. Murray Watt's way of getting through the EPBC Act in the form he wants it is to deal with the coalition, get a deal done quickly with them by the end of the year, preferably, and it's win-win. The Greens, the crossbench, everyone else is cut out, and you don't have to negotiate a climate trigger. I think it may be slightly more complicated than that, because I think the current rebels in the Liberal Party will not want to give Susan Lee a win over the EPBC Act. And Murray Watt might well find that the Liberal Party can't pass what he wants in the EPBC Act, which will force a negotiation in the Senate. And that is where I think a debate about Scope 3 emissions and the EPBC Act can be included. I mean, certainly we expect the Senate inquiry to go into this as well. But I think more and more the issue of this responsibility for Scope 3 emissions is becoming a live issue. I think it's a fascinating issue. I'm not saying it's right in the end. It may well be that everyone sticks to what the UN framework says, but the more climate lawyers I talk to, the more I'm hearing that since the ICJ case, this idea of responsibility by fossil fuel exporters is becoming increasingly a live issue. And it probably will be at COP30 in Brazil. And if COP31 is in Adelaide, I'm sure it will be.
Okay, last quick question. What sort of responses have you had? You know, has Meg O'Neill sent you flowers? Has the WA government or the PM's office, have they sent you flowers? What sort of feedback have you had in responses?
The feedback from Woodside is absolute silence, apart from a lot of social media posting on decarbonisation and how vital it is that we decarbonise Asia, and similarly from the WA government. But one thing that has interested me a lot, like particularly when I was in Perth, was people coming up to me and people calling me from the WA Labor Party, really interested, buying copies of the essay to give to their state and federal MPs in Perth, Labor MPs, a lot of people wanting to take them to branches And there is, although the Labor Party is very union dominated over there and very supportive of blue collar jobs and very supportive of the gas industry, there is a growing realisation, certainly in the Labor Party, if not in the Liberal Party, that the vital thing they all want to protect, which is blue collar jobs, which are so important for that economy, it may not happen unless the energy transition can actually transition industry in Perth to renewable energy. And a lot of people don't realise, you know, like the gas industry has this very good PR campaign, which is you need gas to keep the lights on and keep you warm in winter. And we always see those old images of the polar bear and the, you know, the gas ring on the stove. But the reality is, in WA especially, and elsewhere, it's industry that really matters with the gas. Only about 8% of WA's gas goes to homes and commercial buildings. All the rest is for industry. They're making, I think people like Roger Cook,